Welcome to Breathing for Singing Part 1. In this video, we'll be discussing what's going on anatomically when we breathe. I want to point out this book that I used as a resource for this video. It's called What Every Singer Needs to Know About the Body by Melissa Malday, Mary Jean Allen, and Kurt Alexander Zeller. I would really encourage you to look into this book if you're curious to learn more about the anatomy of singing. So when we're discussing the anatomy of singing, it's really important that we identify the key players in breathing. So our first key player is, of course, the diaphragm. So you've probably heard mention of the diaphragm at choir rehearsals or in voice lessons, other places. Now, the diaphragm is the principal muscle of inhalation. And you can see here, it is dome-shaped at rest, and it contracts on the inhale, meaning that it contracts and actually kind of flattens onto the viscera. And the viscera is just a fancy word for your guts. So the diaphragm actually divides your torso in half. It separates the thoracic cavity, which is this breathing part of your cavity, from the abdominal cavity, which is the guts part of your cavity, part of your torso, I'm sorry. An important thing to know about the diaphragm is that we actually don't have any sensory receptors, meaning we can't feel the diaphragm move, nor do we have any direct agency or control over the diaphragm. And this will have some implications in our part 2 video where we talk about the practicality of breathing for singing. But for now, I want to show you a video from 3D Yoga. And this is available on YouTube if you're interested. And as you're watching this video, I want to encourage you to put your hands, sort of palpate where you feel that bottom of your rib cage and up into your sternum where that diaphragm connects, and breathe along with this video and see if you can notice this range of motion that the diaphragm has. And here we go.
The primary muscle of respiration is the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a thin, dome-shaped layer of muscle and tendon that separates the abdominal cavity from the chest cavity. It gains its shape from its attachments and from the organs that surround it, especially the heart, lungs, and liver. The diaphragm attaches at the costals along the lower rib cage, high in the front at the sternum, and deeply in the back along the spine. The diaphragm also attaches to itself via a central tendon, making the diaphragm one of the unique muscles of the body. The diaphragm uses its central tendon and its attachments as leverage to flatten during inhalation. The expansion of the ribs comes from the resistance of the internal organs to downward movement. As the internal organs are slow to move, the ribs expand to make room for the lungs. While the diaphragm attaches at the bottom of the ribs, its range of motion never reaches that low in the body. As seen from below, we get a sense of the full range of motion of the diaphragm as it would glide over the aorta, the vena cava, the esophagus, and the internal organs. For more information, visit www.3dyoga.com.
Great. So the diaphragm is connected to the rib cage, which of course means then that the rib cage is going to be a key player in singing, or excuse me, breathing as well. So what you probably noticed when you were feeling on your own body and watching the video is that when we are breathing, the rib cage is going to swing out, up, and open. So it's an out, up, and open motion. Here's a quote from What Every Singer Needs to Know About the Body. When we move the ribs on inhalation, we bring them closer together and elevate them. Now, some of this is directly because of the diaphragm sort of pushing against the bottom of the rib cage. So some of this occurs naturally. When we're learning to breathe for singing, we're also going to invite a bit more range of motion in the rib cage than you would do when you're just breathing in general. So we're going to kind of develop that range of motion and flexibility in the rib cage through voice lessons. I want to show you this video, and again, you can kind of palpate your own rib cage and feel what's going on in your own body with what you see visually. But this video really details all of the range of motion of the rib cage. You'll see how the arrows point up and out, and the rib cage is opening with each inhale. Here's our side view. Notice the ribs in the back. That video is available to you on YouTube. So our next key player is the abdominal wall. There we go. So the abdominal wall is comprised of several different abdominal muscles. And a lot of the times when we think of the ab muscles, we assume that it's just in the front. It's just that sort of six-pack layer that we have for people who work out a lot and don't have any body fat. But the ab muscles are actually also down sort of toward the pubic bone, and up at the rib cage and to the side and a little bit back as well. So the abdominal muscles extend all the way down to the pubic bone on the bottom and overlap the lower ribs on the top. What we want to recognize is the abdominal muscle is really important for inhalation because we need room for the diaphragm to be able to descend. So if the abdominal wall is stiff or locked, we're really not going to get as much range of motion for the diaphragm or really for the rib cage. So the role of the abdominal wall is to release or relax at the inhale. And this is going to help the diaphragm be able to extend a little bit lower onto the viscera. Now the same is true for the pelvic floor. So this is our final key player in the breathing process. Now the pelvic floor is a muscle, it's a thin muscle that's connected to the lower pelvic bone. So you can kind of see the pelvic floor from above here. And it's shaped like a shallow bowl. And it sort of mirrors the dome of the diaphragm. And just like the abdominal wall, the more release we can achieve from the pelvic floor at the inhale, the lower the diaphragm is going to be able to descend into the viscera. So the role of the pelvic floor for breathing is to release and relax on the inhalation. So whereas the diaphragm sort of represents the top of that abdominal cavity, the pelvic floor is the bottom of the abdominal cavity. And so a lot of the times we can have kind of a narrow view of the breathing process. We think it's just the lungs or it's just the diaphragm, but it really is a full torso event. It's sort of a top of the thighs experience. We're really using all of our torso when we're breathing. So how do all of these key players connect? So the key players all relate to one another. When we're thinking about breathing, we really want to have a holistic approach to it. So I'll read this paragraph, but what I would encourage you to do is pause this video after I've read it and linger on each of these players and their role in the breathing along as you're thinking about their roles. So here we go. When we inhale, the diaphragm contracts, the dome pushes down on the viscera and out on the lower ribs. The muscles that elevate the ribs contract simultaneously, raising the ribs at the sides and bringing them closer together. The abdominal muscles and pelvic floor release to allow the full excursion of the diaphragm and ribs. These actions expand the thoracic cavity, creating a vacuum in the lungs and drawing in breath. So this is a fun video, and it's actually meant for weightlifting, for teaching weightlifters forced inspiration. And you can actually look this up on your own time on YouTube by typing in muscles in motion, what muscles are used for forced inspiration. But I wanted to show this video to you, just a bit of it, so you can see how all of our body is really involved in the breathing process. So when we say that it's all connected, our whole bodies are our instruments, we really mean it. And this video will kind of help you see how all of your muscles are really connected to the singing process. So here's a video of the breathing process. And first we're going to look at the scalene muscles and their role in breathing. Then the sternocleidomastoid muscles, which we will sometimes talk about when we're talking about an open throat. Here are your pecs and their role in breathing. Here are the intercostal muscles. And lastly, the diaphragm. So that's just if you're interested in learning more information about breathing, if you're interested in nerding out a little bit. Really though, the main source that I referenced in this book is What Every Singer Needs to Know About the Body. So a lot of my lecture is based on what this book sort of details. So I'd encourage you to check this book out. And in part 2, we'll discuss more of the practical application for this information. But in the meantime, I hope you find this helpful and that you reflect on this throughout the week. Thank you so much and happy singing.